When I was 16, I became ill with pheochromocytoma, a very rare condition, a kind of tumor. It took a year for the doctors to figure out what was wrong with me and decide to operate on me. On the operation table, they administered an anesthetic that took action quickly. At the time, I was suspended above the operating area, just beneath the large lamps. Despite my 2-meter height, everything appeared to be in a cathedral, with a ceiling at least 6 meters high. Soon after, the chief surgeon entered the room and exclaimed, "Ah, the girl is already asleep." I was observing the activity in the surgery room. Because the operation was highly rare, many doctors, trainees, and students came to see. Every year, 1 or 2 people in my own country become ill with this condition, and 9 out of 10 people die without being diagnosed. So it turned out that I was fortunate. I saw the world very differently while I was hanging over my body, waiting for the operation to begin. I had a tremendous sense of relaxation, pacification, and inner calm. I looked down at the sleeping figure below and assumed it was myself, but it wasn't. As if my body were a borrowed machine that I needed to complete some chores with. I was realizing that my personality is made up of numerous parts, one of which I'd left at the time, and which reflected my sex, age, nationality, and outward appearance, but I was still inhabiting the others. I felt no pity or affection to the stretched on several machines' body, as if it were a worn and removed article of clothing. I was feeling the emotions of individual persons, as well as the emotions that overpowered everyone when I was monitoring the operating room. Soon, the operation team of 3 surgeons arrived. The main surgeon was an elderly professor, 67 years old at the time, who had performed such an operation in his youth. There was no one with experience with my unusual condition among the others. All participants and viewers were impacted by the immense tension and expectation, coupled with excitement and terror, just before they began. Everyone was silent and still for several seconds. The primary surgeon then made an incision on the skin. My body was rotated on the right side and bound together because the tumor was in the left adrenal gland. I was seeing the steady cutting of the tissues further and deeper till the adrenal gland was no longer accessible. The tension became unbearably strong. The professor observed the gland without touching it for a while. Nobody knew what would happen. They were expecting a burst of hormones as a result of the touch. In theory, the gland is small, and there may be some excrescence on it. It was assumed that this was the tumor, and the physician's first plan was to cut it. Later, it was discovered that the entire core of the gland had been changed into a tumor, which had broken the gland's wrapper slightly and emerged on the surface. Finally, the professor decided to operate, and I sensed a high level of anxiety in the operating room. The concerns of everyone were validated when the scalpel touched the gland. That same instant stretched 1 millisecond, as if time had abruptly slowed. Many things happened all at once. I felt the panic that washed over everyone, a high shriek that was heard from the equipment that was measuring the heart rate at the same time. I felt the impulse of a start of a lightning-fast movement, energy with which everyone on the operating team hastened to do something. Time seemed to stretch so far that it resembled a painting in which individuals with entwined hands were passing each other various items and attempting to do something. At that time, I felt a huge suction from my back, where the lamps were, so strong that I couldn't resist it no matter how hard I tried. The turmoil and terror below, as well as the shouts, were unfathomable. Yet this also lasted less than a second, at the same time that I was sucked. The next thing I knew, I was flying at full speed into a completely dark tunnel with some gleams and a yellow dot glowing ahead of me. The dot approached swiftly, and the tunnel threw me away, like a man falling from the edges of a water slide into a pool, in some foreign location. It was deserted. The sensations of being above, below, or sideways were all relative. Although there was no floor, I was not flying. The air was milk yellow, similar to the densest fog you've ever seen, illuminated by yellow fog lights, but one could see through it. 5 bright yellow human forms appeared in front of me. One of them was the main character. I had the impression it was a woman, but I didn't recognize any of them. I wanted to examine her face features, but the more I looked, the less I saw. When I finally gave up, I sensed her features in the same way you do when you try to view something with your peripheral vision. The company was welcoming, and we were communicating with our opinions. They led me to a bizarre location in the midst of the yellow fog. 3 flawless spheres were arranged in such a way that they formed an equilateral triangle, with one more sphere in the center that was larger than the other 3. I asked what that was, but I didn't get a response. But I did notice a difference. I wasn't sure what the difference was at first, but I saw how the yellow fog was steadily darkening. I had the impression that I was moving. I saw the stars as the yellow turned dark blue, then black. It was enormous. I realized that if I turned around, I would see the Earth. When I looked around, I was taken aback by the wonderful sight. The Earth was beautiful and so close. I had the impression she was alive, and if the planet itself was a being. After a while of admiring it, I looked around and spotted hundreds of small particles spinning around it. There were 2 kinds in general. The first were ugly, mean, distorted, made up of an endless number of components, and looked ludicrous and antediluvian. The second type was occupied and appeared gleaming, cast from the best materials. There were living beings all around and within them. There were at least 3 or 4 different kinds. There was a contraption nearby, with beings 2.5 to 3 meters tall watching me. "Who are you?" I inquired. "Your buddies," they said. "What are you doing?" I inquired. Something happened at that time, and instead of responding, they pointed to the Earth, which was on my left side. When I turned towards it, I saw a blue ray of light, akin like a laser, moving across the heavens. It was unusual that it had a beginning and an end, like a train, and not like a ray of light, which has no beginning or finish. The ray arrived on Earth, passed through it, and then continued into the cosmos. The Earth began to sparkle with a lovely blue halo. I received the impression that a huge significant event had occurred, which is a good thing. Earth seemed to be buzzing with life, like an aroused beehive. I felt the spiritedness, happiness, pacification, and joy that was streaming out of the beings on Earth all at once. I felt gravity bring me back to Earth at that instant. I only managed to wave the lofty creatures goodbye before they returned with a smile. The feeling of a smile is more accurate. I flew towards Earth, which was odd and exciting, and in an instant, while flying at high speed, I found myself in the yellow fog without falling and landing. In general, the space in that location was highly relative, and the sense of time was hazy. The group moved to the side, and I observed as 2 boys, aged 7 and 14, greeted me. The boys took me to another weird spot, a natural image that looked like a model in the yellow fog, but once inside, everything is true and real. I found myself in the center of a hilly terrain next to a medium-sized lake. It was the beginning of autumn. We sat on the lake's side and observed nature. The trees' leaves became yellow and then fell off. It rained and became hazy. This went on for a long time. It snowed once the rain ceased. The lake had frozen. It snowed for quite some time. Then the snow stopped falling, and everything froze for years and years. It had been a very lengthy winter. Finally, drops and brooks ran, and the lake began to crackle deafeningly as the ice melted. I was intrigued because I'd never heard such a crackle before. The spring arrived. Everything bloomed. Then the scorching summer with its merry insects arrived, and it became early fall once more. I had no idea what this regular cycle of seasons meant until now. The youngsters then pointed to a path on the right side of the lake that went beneath a hill, and along the way was a very tall person. A true giant, slightly stooping and about 1.8 meters tall. I know it seems strange, but this is how I saw him. The man was in his 40s or 50s and was guiding a horse and wagon. He was coming after a 2 or 3 day journey to a nearby city to sell something. He was walking carefully and despondently, keeping an eye on his legs. It became dark. Suddenly, I found myself looking at the world through the eyes of this man. He had a petite wife and 8 children, the last of whom was a newborn. He was a poor peasant who struggled to support his family, although he was considered middle class among peasants. His native tongue was German, but he was also fluent in French. He lived outside of the city and farmed the land. When I started looking through his eyes, I realized everything. He rounded the hill, and in front of him was a large plain, in the center of which was an ugly, gloomy, melancholy city, insignificant in our opinion. The Middle Ages were the historical period. He arrived in the city and entered. The image I saw through his eyes was so striking that it could not be seen in even the most daringly constructed and realistic Hollywood film about the Middle Ages. 2 meters separated the streets. They were covered in half a meter of mud, as well as animal and human waste. An old woman, dressed like a witch, without teeth, ugly, dirty, and repulsive, shoved something disgusting into my face and tried to sell it to me. There were dirty youngsters without pants on one of the 1.5-meter wide bridges, and they were staring at me with big eyes. They appeared to be psychologically ill. I made my way through the mob till I reached the city center. All of the citizens gathered on the square. They remained behind a circle of troops clothed in amusing chainmail and armed with swords. The tallest person stood at roughly 1.6 meters. 4 gallows were built in the center of the square. Ropes were wrapped around the necks of those who were going to be hanged. The man whose eyes I was seeing through observed that his 14-year-old son, one of the children following me, was still on the gallows at that moment. They were hanged at this time. The man, or I, let go of the horse's reins, yelled and dashed to the gallows. One of the knights stopped him and pierced him through the heart. The man collapsed and died, and I began to observe the happenings as an invisible person among the crowd. When the audience saw all of this, it went insane, tore the cordon, and a terrible murder ensued. In the crowd was the wife of the murdered and mother of the hanged boy, as well as one of her children, who was 7 years old, but appeared to be 3 or 4. The throng dragged the child away from his mother, and when one of the soldiers in armor spotted him, he took out a sword and hacked off the child's head for no apparent cause. This was the other youngster who was with me. Suddenly, I found myself on the lake's shore. I was in shock. My consciousness was warped. I was seeing flashes of what I'd just seen. I was crying and shaking, despite the fact that I didn't have a physical body. This is how I felt. For a long period, the kids were soothing me till I returned to my senses. When I recovered consciousness, I was taken out of the model and placed in the yellow fog. The group was already waiting for me. Then everything went dark, as if someone had turned off the fog light. I was terrified, but I was even more terrified when I noticed that the people in my group were also terrified. I too was terrified. "What's going on?" I exclaimed. "What's going on?" The others were all staring at me in horror. I had a feeling that something horrible would happen to me right then and there, that my fate would be decided. Nobody responded. Everyone was still in shock. Then I heard a voice from a long distance away say, "Calm down. Everything will be fine. Everything will be fine." I listened to the voice and relaxed a little. After a time, it brightened up again, and I watched how the gathering exhaled a sigh of relief. When I later told my parents about this, my mother burst into tears and revealed that she had been speaking to me inwardly throughout the procedure. The kids then took me aside, and we had a serious discussion about what was going to happen in my life, and they told me that I would forget what we were talking about. We had a long talk, and when it was finished, we said our goodbyes, and I was on the operating table. I could feel them sewing me up, but I couldn't say anything. Couldn't even move or show that I was conscious, and it ached. In front of my eyes, the youngsters were waving from afar in that yellow fog, saying that we will meet again soon. Today, I learned that one of the jobs we were discussing at the time, and that I'd forgotten about, has now been finished. It's a personal one, therefore I won't say anything about it. I also know that on that day, I had to die and would never return to Earth. But beings of great spiritual strength redeemed me, but only for this. On that day, I had to spend a long period in a dark and terrible area. If you like, you can call it hell. It made no difference that I was still a child. My previous evil deeds had to take me to a place where I might redeem them before returning to Earth and having the option to live as a human being, but with a heavy destiny. Now I know what deeds resulted in this retribution, but that's another long story. After this physical death experience, I awoke as a completely different person. I evolved a lot over time, and now I have a different perspective on the world and what I have and don't have to do. I discovered that I had a strong desire for spiritual growth and enlightenment, that this was the only way and goal, and that without it, life has no value and is a waste of time. I was able to look forward and backward in time after the operation, and I remembered many previous lives. To my dismay, my lack of consciousness in the past has left me quite disillusioned. I also recognize that while extrasensory impressions are common for all humans, they should not be employed because they confine the soul to the lower realms of the spiritual world. To anyone who've read this far, I would like to say that dying is not remarkable, much more special and significant, aside from understanding one's position and purpose in life, is living. Last but not least, I do not deny the presence of God as a wise power, and his essence is holy love, compassion, and forgiveness. He never refuses anything requested for, but he does offer most of it to people who want to be near him.